Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something that chills you to the bone, something far more insidious than the battlefields or the bombs. We're going to peel back the layers of a regime that sought to not just control bodies, but minds, delving into the strange, often horrific, psychological experiments of Nazi Germany. Forget the simplistic notions of mad scientists in labs. This was a society-wide experiment in human manipulation. Before we plunge into that dark abyss, do me a solid, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop your location and the current time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from around the globe. Alright, find that cozy spot, pull your blankets up tight, and let's begin this unsettling journey through the human psyche. You find yourself standing on a crisp, cold morning in a Berlin that barely registers in your modern consciousness. A Berlin before the war, before the bombs, but not before the shadow. The air bites at your cheeks, carrying with it the faint scent of coal smoke and damp earth, a stark contrast to the filtered, climate-controlled air you breathe today. You clutch the lapels of your heavy, coarse wool coat, feeling the scratch of the fabric against your skin, a discomfort that your modern, soft clothing has long since eradicated. You're not here as a tourist, but as an observer, an almost ghostly presence, tasked with seeing the nascent stages of a grand, terrifying design. Imagine, if you will, the hum of anticipation, a low thrum beneath the veneer of ordinary life. Propaganda posters, vibrant in their bold, stark imagery, plaster every available surface, their messages insidious, repetitive, beginning to seep into the collective unconscious like a slow-acting poison. You read the slogans, seeing the heroic figures, the promises of a glorious future, and you feel a subtle tug, an almost imperceptible pressure to conform, to believe. It's not shouting at you. It's whispering, suggesting, shaping. You see people stop, glance, nod. Their expression's a mix of pride, fear, and a strange, unquestioning acceptance. This is the initial, large-scale psychological experiment. As conditioning. You walk past a bustling market, the sounds of hawkers calling out their wares, the clatter of carts, the murmur of conversations. But even amidst this everyday chaos, you sense an underlying current of tension. You catch snippets of dialogue, hushed tones discussing the party, the leader, the Jewish question. It's no longer just political rhetoric. It's becoming the fabric of daily conversation, normal, acceptable, even expected. You realize how easily fear, when mixed with promise and national pride, can become a tool, not just of control, but of transformation. Your modern sensibilities recoil, but you force yourself to observe, to understand how this insidious process begins. You watch children in uniforms, marching with an almost frightening precision, their faces alight with an almost religious fervor. The Hitler Youth, you hear their songs, simple, catchy, praising strength, loyalty, sacrifice. These aren't just children playing, they are the future, being molded from the tenderest age, their psychological landscape being meticulously sculpted. You see the glint in their eyes, the eagerness to please, to belong, to be part of something grander than themselves. You recognize the powerful human need for identity, for purpose, now being harnessed, distorted, and weaponized. Your own childhood, filled with choices and independent thought, feels a million miles away from their regimented existence. You enter a smoky Biergarten, the air thick with the scent of beer, sausages, and cheap tobacco. The conversations here are louder, more boisterous, but the underlying themes remain. You hear men debating the latest decrees, justifying them, explaining away inconsistencies, slowly but surely internalizing the regime's logic. You see how dissent is subtly stifled, not always through overt force, but through social pressure, through the fear of being seen as other, as disloyal. You note the self-censorship, the quick glances over shoulders before someone dares to voice a slightly dissenting opinion, only to quickly retract it with a nervous laugh. You understand that this isn't just about what people are told to believe. It's about what they are allowed to believe. and more powerfully, what they choose to believe, to survive, to fit in. The architects of this mind game aren't always men in white coats in sterile labs. They are the propagandists, the educators, the party officials, the local block leaders, even the neighbors who report on one another. They are the ones who understand the subtle levers of human psychology, the need for belonging, the fear of isolation, the desire for order, the susceptibility to charismatic leadership, the power of repetition. You feel a shiver crawl down your spine, realizing the chilling sophistication of this approach. It's not just about brute force. It's about making people want what the regime wants, about making them internalize its values until they become their own. You observe the subtle shifts in language, how words once neutral become loaded, how terms are redefined, how entire groups of people are systematically dehumanized through rhetoric. You hear Jewish become synonymous with problem, threat, vermin. You realize the immense psychological power of language, how it shapes perception, how it can create an us and a them, eroding empathy and paving the way for unthinkable acts. Your modern ears, accustomed to the careful calibration of language, are assaulted by the casual cruelty, the accepted hatred, the normalization of prejudice. You spend your days watching, listening, absorbing. You see the rallies, the torchlit parades, the sheer spectacle designed to overwhelm the senses, to bypass rational thought, and to appeal directly to emotion, to a primal sense of collective power and belonging. You feel the roar of the crowd, a physical vibration in your chest, and you can almost feel the intoxicating pull, the temptation to lose yourself in the collective euphoria, to shed your individual identity for the comforting embrace of the group. You understand that these are not just political events. They are meticulously crafted psychological experiences designed to forge a new collective identity, to erase individual doubt and replace it with unwavering faith. As evening falls, you retreat to a small, nondescript room, the single bulb casting long shadows across the walls. You write your observations in a small notebook, your pen scratching softly on the paper. You reflect on the sheer scale of the psychological manipulation unfolding before you. It's not a single experiment with a control group and variables. It's an entire nation, an entire population, being subjected to a continuous, pervasive psychological assault. The goal to reshape reality, to rewrite morality, to create a new kind of human being, one utterly devoted to the state, one willing to sacrifice everything, and crucially, one willing to participate in unthinkable acts without question. You close your notebook, the silence of the room amplifying the unsettling thoughts swirling in your mind. The air outside grows colder, and you pull your heavy coat tighter, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that has settled deep within your soul. You understand now that the foundation of the horrors to come wasn't just built with tanks and guns, but with carefully constructed lies, fear, and a profound, chilling understanding of the human mind. The psychological experiments had begun long before the war, a silent, unseen battle for the very essence of human consciousness. You wake with a start, the dim light filtering through the thin curtains, doing little to dispel the lingering unease from your nocturnal observations. The crisp air still carries the tang of coal and damp earth, a constant reminder of where and when you are. Today, you are drawn to the institutions of learning, for it is here, you realize, that the true psychological battle for the future is being fought. You step into a schoolyard, the clamor of children at play jarringly familiar, yet profoundly unsettling in this new context. The laughter is innocent, yes, but the uniforms, the disciplined lines forming for assembly, the earnest faces looking up at their teachers, it all speaks of a carefully curated environment. A psychological crucible. You observe the textbooks, their pages filled not with objective history or diverse literature, but with revised narratives, heroic tales of Aryan superiority, and thinly veiled denunciations of enemies. You see mathematics problems framed around calculating the cost of caring for the infirm or racial undesirables, subtly embedding insidious concepts into the minds of children. It's not just rote learning, it's the systematic infusion of an ideology presented as fact, as logic, as truth. You realize how vulnerable young minds are, how permeable their sense of reality, and how easily they can be shaped when presented with a single, unchallenged narrative. Your own education, with its emphasis on critical thinking and multiple perspectives, feels like a radical luxury. You sit in a classroom, a silent observer in the back row. The teacher, a stern but engaging woman, speaks with unwavering conviction, her voice carrying an authority that brooks no argument. She describes the history of Germany not as a complex tapestry of events, but as a linear progression towards a glorious destiny, interrupted only by the machinations of external and internal foes. You watch the children, their eyes wide, soaking in every word. You see them absorb the rhetoric, the justifications, the hatred, not as abstract concepts, but as fundamental truths about the world. Their questions are not challenging. They are seeking clarification within the established framework, eager to demonstrate their understanding and loyalty. The psychological experiment here is one of total immersion. There is no counter-narrative, no alternative viewpoint offered. The world is presented in stark black and white, good and evil, Aryan and un-Aryan. You understand that this creates a cognitive closed loop, where any information conflicting with the official narrative is automatically dismissed as false, as propaganda from the enemy. This isn't just about teaching, it's about forming neural pathways, about conditioning young minds to automatically accept one truth and reject all others. It's a terrifyingly effective method for building a generation of true believers. You follow a group of older boys to a Hitler Youth meeting. The air crackles with energy and youthful testosterone. They aren't just learning drills, they're undergoing physical training designed to instill discipline, resilience, and a sense of collective strength. But the true psychological work is happening in their discussions, in the campfire stories of heroism and sacrifice, in the songs that extol racial purity and nationalistic pride. You hear them discuss their future roles, their duty, their willingness to fight and die for the fatherland. You see the transformation, the individual personalities beginning to meld into a collective identity, a singular purpose. The leaders, often not much older than the boys themselves, are masters of psychological manipulation, instilling a sense of camaraderie, belonging, and shared destiny. They create an environment where individualism is discouraged, where questioning is seen as weakness, and where loyalty to the group and its ideals is paramount. You realize how powerful this sense of belonging can be, especially for adolescents searching for identity. It offers them a ready-made purpose, a uniform, a community, and a clear enemy to define themselves against. Your own teenage years, filled with angst and self-discovery, seem utterly indulgent compared to the stark purpose imposed upon these young men. You observe girls in the League of German Girls meetings, their activities focused on domestic duties, physical fitness, and preparing for motherhood. But the underlying psychological message is just as potent. Their role is to be the bearers of the pure Aryan race, the nurturers of the next generation of soldiers and loyal citizens. Their songs, their discussions, their very activities are designed to instill a specific set of values, to define their worth solely through their contribution to the racial purity and strength of the nation. You see the pride in their eyes, the earnestness with which they embrace these roles, never questioning the inherent limitations or the profound psychological burden of being valued solely for biological and domestic functions. The insidious nature of this ideological infusion is its pervasiveness. It's not confined to schoolrooms or youth groups. It's in the radio broadcasts that constantly repeat the same messages, in the films that demonize enemies and glorify the state, in the popular music, in the very language of public discourse. You try to imagine living in such an environment where every sensory input, every social interaction, every piece of information reinforces a single, all-encompassing ideology. You wonder how long your own critical faculties would survive, How long before the constant barrage began to erode your ability to think independently, to question, to doubt? You noticed the shift in facial expressions, in body language, a growing uniformity, a subtle hardening around the eyes, a confident, almost arrogant posture in those who fully embrace the ideology. And then there are the others, the ones whose eyes dart nervously, whose shoulders are slightly hunched, who speak in hushed tones or avoid eye contact altogether. The psychological pressure to conform is immense, and you witness its effects in real time. It's a silent, constant experiment in social coercion, where the cost of non-conformity is not just social ostracism, but the very real threat of worse as the day ends, and you retreat once more into the quiet solitude of your room. You reflect on the sheer psychological violence being perpetrated, not with fists or weapons, but with words, images, and carefully constructed environments. It's a violence against the individual mind, against the very capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning. You realize that by shaping the minds of the young, by controlling the narrative, by saturating every aspect of life with a singular ideology, the regime is not just creating soldiers or obedient citizens, it's attempting to engineer a new consciousness, a collective mind utterly devoid of internal conflict or moral ambiguity regarding its terrifying goals. The chilling effectiveness of this ideological infusion is precisely what makes it one of the most profound and devastating psychological experiments in human history. The silence of your room feels heavy, laden with the echoes of conditioned voices, and you find yourself questioning the very nature of belief and how easily it can be twisted. You wake to a grey, oppressive morning, the sky heavy with the promise of rain, mirroring the weight that has settled in your chest. Today, your journey takes you to the heart of another insidious psychological experiment, the systematic dehumanization of an entire people. You find yourself in a city that feels subtly different from the bustling Berlin you've observed before. This is a place where fear is palpable, a low hum beneath the surface of everyday life, and you feel a strange tightening in your stomach, a knot of dread. You walk through streets where certain shop windows are conspicuously empty, their owners gone. Yellow stars begin to appear on the coats of people, not just as a mark of identification, but as a brand, a visual cue for others to distance themselves. You observe the subtle shifts in social interaction. Once there might have been casual greetings, shared smiles. Now you see averted gazes, hurried footsteps, and a chilling silence that descends when a person bearing the star passes by. You realize that this is a deliberate psychological barrier being erected, one brick at a time, between human beings. The propaganda has intensified. Posters no longer just glorify the Aryan ideal. They vilify the other with grotesque caricatures and venomous slogans. You see newspaper headlines screaming about Jewish conspiracy, racial pollution, the enemy within. These aren't just words. They are carefully crafted psychological weapons designed to bypass rational thought and tap into primal fears and prejudices. You notice how the constant repetition begins to wear down resistance, how the outrageous slowly becomes acceptable, how the unthinkable begins to seem inevitable. You witness an incident in the street. A shopkeeper, normally jovial, now brusquely dismisses a customer wearing the star, his face hardened, his voice devoid of any warmth. You see the customer's face, a mixture of shame, resignation, and a profound, bone-deep weariness. Your modern understanding of civility and basic human respect is shattered by the casual cruelty, the open disdain, the accepted prejudice that hangs heavy in the air like a noxious gas. You realize that the dehumanization isn't just happening to the victims. It's also happening to the perpetrators and the bystanders, stripping them of their empathy, their moral compass. This is a psychological experiment in perception, in redefining what it means to be human. By constantly associating a group with negativity, with disease, with criminality, with all that is perceived as undesirable, the regime seeks to strip them of their personhood in the minds of the general populace. You realize the chilling effectiveness of this strategy. Once a group is no longer seen as human, once they are categorized as vermin or cancer, then acts against them, no matter how horrific, become justifiable, even necessary. The moral boundaries begin to blur, then dissolve entirely. You visit a public park, once a place of relaxation and shared enjoyment. Now signs declaring Jews forbidden or for Aryans only are prominently displayed. You see families with children strolling, picnicking, enjoying themselves, oblivious or indifferent to the systematic exclusion. You notice how the presence of these signs and the absence of those who are excluded creates a new normal. It reinforces the idea that the excluded group is indeed different, undesirable, not worthy of sharing public spaces. This physical segregation is a powerful psychological tool, cementing the perception of otherness. You hear children on the playground mimicking the adult rhetoric, chanting crude rhymes about Jewish pigs or dirty Jews. You feel a cold dread spread through you, realizing that the psychological poison has permeated even the youngest minds, turning innocence into instruments of hatred. This is not just talk. It is absorbed, internalized, becoming a part of their worldview, their understanding of who belongs and who does not. Your own memories of childhood, of open curiosity and acceptance, seem impossibly naive in this grim reality. You watch as people are forced from their homes, their meager possessions piled onto carts, their faces etched with despair. You see neighbors watch from behind curtains, some with pity, some with grim satisfaction, most with a chilling indifference. The psychological experiment here is also one of desensitization. The constant exposure to discrimination, to violence, to injustice, without intervention, without consequence, slowly numbs the populace. What was once shocking becomes commonplace. What was once unacceptable becomes tolerable. The capacity for empathy is systematically eroded, replaced by apathy or even complicity. The language you hear is full of euphemisms: resettlement instead of forced deportation, special treatment instead of murder. These linguistic distortions are another psychological tool designed to obscure the brutal reality from both the perpetrators and the general public. By cloaking horrific acts in bureaucratic language, the regime attempts to alleviate any potential moral distress, allowing individuals to participate or witness without confronting the full horror of their actions. You realize how easily language can be manipulated to sanitize unspeakable cruelty, to allow a society to commit atrocities while telling itself a different story. As darkness falls, you retreat to your quiet room, the silence a stark contrast to the psychological cacophony you've witnessed all day. You try to reconcile the images of everyday life, the baker selling bread, the children playing, the couples strolling, with the systematic campaign of hatred and dehumanization unfolding simultaneously. You realize that the most terrifying psychological experiment isn't just about what people are made to believe, but what they are made to unbelieve about their fellow human beings. It's the psychological destruction of empathy, the deliberate severing of the bonds of common humanity. You feel a profound sense of despair, understanding the depth of the damage inflicted not just on the victims, but on the soul of the society itself. The dehumanization protocol is a psychological weapon of mass destruction, capable of dismantling moral frameworks and unleashing the darkest impulses of humanity. You close your eyes, but the images persist. The yellow stars, the averted gazes, the hardened faces, the casual cruelty. You realize the chilling power of psychological manipulation to turn human beings into something unrecognizable, both those who suffer and those who inflict the suffering. The air outside your window feels colder than ever, carrying with it the invisible, heavy dust of shattered humanity. The morning brings with it a crisp chill that seems to penetrate directly to your bones, a physical sensation mirroring the psychological coldness you've begun to feel. Today, your journey leads you to observe the very machinery of the state. not in its grand pronouncements, but in its daily function, to understand the chilling psychological experiment of obedience to authority. You find yourself amidst the bureaucratic hustle and bustle in government offices and police stations, places that in your modern world are symbols of order and justice, but here, under this regime, take on a profoundly sinister cast. You watch men and women in uniforms, clerks, officers, administrators, carrying out their duties with meticulous precision. They process paperwork, issue decrees, enforce regulations, all within a vast hierarchical structure. You notice their demeanor, often stern, efficient, rarely questioning. You see their deference to superiors, their expectation of obedience from subordinates. This is a system built on unquestioning compliance, a psychological framework where individual moral responsibility is diluted by the chain of command. Your modern understanding of individual agency and personal accountability feels like a distant luxury in this environment. You observe the public interactions. People approaching uniformed officers, their shoulders slightly hunched, their voices hushed, an underlying current of fear mingled with respect. You realize that the authority isn't just symbolic. It's backed by the omnipresent threat of coercion, of punishment, of the unknown consequences for stepping out of line. This constant, subtle threat creates a psychological climate of pervasive anxiety, where conformity becomes the safest, indeed, often the only, option. You feel a prickle of fear yourself, an instinctual reaction to the raw power on display. You are struck by the banality of much of the evil. It's not always grand, dramatic acts of cruelty. Often it's a clerk rubber-stamping a deportation order, an officer enforcing a discriminatory law, a civil servant compiling lists of undesirables. These individuals, by and large, appear to be ordinary people going about their jobs. The psychological experiment here is to demonstrate how easily individuals can become cogs in a machine of destruction, how the abstraction of duty and the diffusion of responsibility can override personal conscience. You wonder how you, in their shoes, would react. Could you resist the immense social and professional pressure? You hear conversations in the corridors, snippets of gossip, complaints about workload, discussions about family. The normalcy is startling, almost jarring, against the backdrop of the horrific policies being enacted. You realize that many of these individuals are compartmentalizing, separating their professional duties from their personal lives, creating a psychological buffer that allows them to perform morally repugnant tasks without fully internalizing their implications. It's a survival mechanism, yes, but a profoundly dangerous one, as it allows atrocities to become routine. You observe training sessions for new recruits, where the emphasis is on discipline, loyalty, and unquestioning adherence to orders. They are taught to depersonalize their targets, to view them as abstractions rather than individuals. This is a deliberate psychological technique designed to minimize empathy and facilitate compliance with brutal commands. You see drills that strip away individuality, replacing it with a collective identity, a uniform purpose. The individual recruit's conscience is systematically eroded, replaced by groupthink and the authority of the leader. The sheer scale of the regime's control is a psychological pressure in itself. There is no escape, no alternative path. The state is everywhere, in every institution, every aspect of life. This creates a feeling of inevitability, of powerlessness, which further reinforces obedience. Why resist, you might wonder, when resistance seems futile and the consequences are so severe? This perceived lack of agency is a powerful psychological deterrent to dissent, fostering compliance through sheer, overwhelming force. You see the fear in the eyes of those who are caught breaking minor regulations, the swift, often disproportionate punishment. This serves as a psychological lesson to others, a stark warning of the consequences of non-compliance. It creates a culture of self-policing, where people are not only afraid of being caught, but also afraid of being seen by others, leading to a pervasive sense of suspicion and distrust. Your modern society, with its emphasis on individual rights and due process, feels incredibly fragile and precious in comparison. You reflect on the infamous psychological experiments of your own time, Milgram, Zimbardo, and realize that the Nazis were conducting a real-world, nationwide iteration of these studies on an unprecedented scale. They understood implicitly the powerful human tendency to obey authority, even when those orders conflict with one's personal morality. They built a system that exploited this tendency to its fullest, creating a vast apparatus of complicity as the day draws to a close and you walk through the darkening streets. The omnipresent posters of the leader staring down at you from every corner, you feel a profound sense of unease. The psychological experiment of obedience and authority is a testament to the fragility of individual conscience in the face of immense institutional power. It demonstrates how ordinary people, under the right conditions, can be induced to participate in, or at least facilitate, extraordinary evil. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the outside temperature, a cold dread about the darker corners of the human psyche that this regime so ruthlessly exploited. The weight of compliance, you realize, is a heavy burden, not just on the individual, but on the very soul of a nation. The early morning fog hangs heavy and damp, clinging to the cobblestone streets and obscuring the buildings in a shroud of mystery, a fitting metaphor for the unseen, pervasive fear that has settled over this land. Today, you are experiencing the psychological experiment of terror, a deliberate and systematic strategy designed to paralyze, to control, and to break the human spirit. The air tastes of damp stone and a faint, acrid scent of something indefinable, something that hints at desperation. You feel it first as a subtle unease, a constant, low-level anxiety that permeates every interaction. People speak in hushed tones, their eyes darting around, quick to avoid direct gaze. Laughter, when it occurs, is often brief, quickly extinguished. There's a palpable sense that someone is always listening, always watching, that a wrong word, a misplaced gesture could have catastrophic consequences. This isn't overt violence in every moment, but the psychological threat of it, omnipresent and unforgiving. You witness the aftermath of arbitrary arrests. A family stands outside their ransacked apartment, their faces a mask of shock and bewilderment. Their neighbors look on, their expressions a mix of pity and a chilling self-preservation, quickly retreating into their homes, pulling curtains closed. This public display of swift, brutal justice, often for reasons unclear to the populace, is a powerful psychological tool. It instills a sense of randomness, of unpredictability, which is far more terrifying than a predictable threat. It tells you that no one is truly safe, that anyone can be next, regardless of their actions. The dreaded Gestapo, the secret state police, are a ghostly presence. You don't always see them, but their shadow is long, their reputation preceding them. A sudden knock on a door in the dead of night, the screech of a car, the abrupt disappearance of a neighbor. These are the silent signals that reinforce the terror. The psychological genius of it lies in its invisibility and unpredictability. You don't know who they are, where they are, or why they act, and this uncertainty gnaws at your mind, creating a constant state of hypervigilance and fear. Your modern sense of security, of due process and individual rights feels like an impossible dream. You see the public executions carefully staged and announced. They are not just punishments, they are theatrical displays designed to instill maximum psychological impact. The sight of a gallows, the hushed crowd, the grim efficiency of the proceedings. It's all meticulously calculated to demonstrate the absolute power of the state and the futility of resistance. You feel a wave of nausea, a primal horror, and you witness the fear etched on the faces of those forced to watch. Understanding that this spectacle is meant for them, a warning branded onto their very souls. The terror extends to the family unit. Children are encouraged to report on their parents, spouses on each other. This deliberate fostering of suspicion and betrayal within the most intimate relationships is a profound psychological attack on the social fabric itself. It erodes trust, isolates individuals, and turns every private space into a potential surveillance zone. You realize how deeply this psychological weapon undermines the very foundations of human connection, turning love and loyalty into potential liabilities. You experience the feeling of being trapped. There is no escape, no obvious sanctuary. The borders are closed, the propaganda relentless, the surveillance pervasive. This sense of inescapable control is a powerful psychological tool, leading to resignation, apathy, and a profound loss of hope. Why resist, you might wonder, when resistance is met with overwhelming force and no quarter is given? The mind begins to internalize its own powerlessness, accepting its fate. The language itself becomes a tool of terror. Words like traitors, enemies of the state, saboteurs are used liberally, attaching extreme stigma and the implicit threat of violence to any form of non-conformity. You hear them whispered, repeated, internalized, and you realize that even thought itself becomes dangerous. The psychological demand is not just for obedience in action, but for conformity in thought, a terrifying quest for total control over the inner life of the individual. As dusk settles, casting long, menacing shadows across the deserted streets, you find yourself seeking the comfort of your small, quiet room, pulling the curtains tightly closed. The silence is not peaceful. It is heavy, pregnant with the unspoken fears of a city under siege by its own government. The psychological experiment of terror is a relentless assault on the human spirit, designed to break the will, to extinguish hope, to turn every individual into a terrified, compliant automaton. You reflect on your modern life, where dissent is celebrated, where justice is sought, where fear is an emotion, not a state of being imposed by the state. You realize the profound difference, the unbearable weight of living under such a regime. The air outside your window feels colder than ever, carrying with it the invisible, heavy dust of shattered nerves and extinguished dreams. The terror, you understand, is not merely physical. It is a deep, psychological wound inflicted upon the very soul of a nation, leaving scars that will endure for generations. You awaken to a morning that feels unnaturally bright, almost jarringly cheerful, a stark contrast to the grim psychological landscapes you've traversed thus far. Today your path leads you to a place of unsettling purpose, a project wrapped in the guise of scientific advancement and racial purity. The Lebensborn program. You find yourself standing before a grand, almost idyllic villa nestled amidst rolling hills, its architecture suggesting comfort and tranquility, yet you feel a profound sense of unease, a cold dread that this beautiful facade hides a monstrous intent. The air here is cleaner, fresher, scented with pine and damp earth, a pastoral ideal that clashes violently with the program's true nature. You see women, young and seemingly healthy, strolling through manicured gardens, some visibly pregnant, others holding infants. They appear well-fed, carefully attended, their faces serene, almost vacant. You realize that this is a psychological experiment in human breeding, an attempt to scientifically engineer a master race, stripping away the organic, emotional complexities of human procreation and reducing it to a biological function, a state-controlled factory for pure Aryan children. You observe the doctors and nurses, immaculately dressed in crisp white uniforms, moving with an air of professional detachment. Their interactions with the women are polite, clinical, devoid of warmth or personal connection. You realize that these aren't just medical professionals. They are the facilitators of a chilling eugenics program, their scientific expertise twisted to serve a perverted ideology. The sterile efficiency of their movements, the absence of any visible emotional engagement, is itself a psychological tool, reinforcing the idea that this is a rational scientific endeavor, free from messy human emotions. You learn about the selection process, The meticulous vetting of both parents based on racial criteria, hair color, eye color, skull measurements, ancestral purity. This is a profound psychological assault on individual identity, reducing people to a collection of desirable physical traits, their worth defined solely by their perceived genetic fitness for the Aryan ideal. You recognize how deeply this devalues individual uniqueness and reduces human beings to mere biological specimens, tools for a larger ideological project. Your modern appreciation for diversity and individual worth is utterly violated by this cold, calculating approach. You imagine the psychological burden on these women, many of whom are unmarried, their pregnancies facilitated by the state with racially pure SS officers. They are not mothers in the conventional sense, raising children within a loving family unit. They are biological vessels, their children destined for state care, to be raised as loyal members of the regime. You see the subtle sadness in some of their eyes, the loneliness, the yearning for something more than this clinical existence. A human emotion that is meticulously suppressed by the program's strictures. The children, once born, are subjected to early psychological conditioning. They are removed from their mothers, placed in nurseries, and raised in an environment saturated with Nazi ideology. They are taught loyalty to the leader, to the state, to the concept of racial purity, long before they can truly understand. You recognize how fragile and impressionable an infant's mind is, how deeply these early experiences can shape their sense of self and their understanding of the world. This is a cruel psychological experiment in total indoctrination from birth, an attempt to bypass family bonds and instill state loyalty as the primary attachment. You hear the official rhetoric surrounding Lebensborn, portraying it as a noble effort to strengthen the German nation, to reverse declining birth rates among racially valuable women. This propaganda is a psychological shield designed to legitimate the program in the eyes of the public and to obscure its underlying eugenic and psychologically manipulative nature. You understand how easily scientific language and patriotic fervor can be used to mask profound moral transgressions. You ponder the psychological impact on the children themselves, raised without knowledge of their true parentage, within a system that values their racial purity above their individual humanity. They are essentially state property, their identities manufactured, their destinies predetermined. You imagine the potential for identity crises, for a deep-seated feeling of alienation, once the truth of their origins or the truth of the regime's ideology eventually comes to light as the sun begins to set, casting long, unsettling shadows across the beautiful, yet sinister villa. You feel a profound sense of revulsion. The Lebensborn program is more than just a medical experiment. It is a grand, horrifying psychological experiment in social engineering, an attempt to control the very essence of human reproduction and development for ideological ends. It highlights the terrifying potential when scientific endeavor is stripped of ethical constraints and placed at the service of a brutal, dehumanizing ideology. You leave the seemingly tranquil villa, the clean air now feeling tainted, the beauty of the landscape overshadowed by the ugliness of its purpose. You carry with you the image of those serene, vacant faces, the engineered innocence of the children, and the chilling realization that humanity's deepest urges to create, to nurture, to love can be twisted into instruments of a profoundly disturbing psychological control. The darkness outside your window feels heavy, laden with the echoes of unborn generations, engineered souls, and a future that never truly found its way. The air this morning is thick and still, carrying the stale scent of old wood and something metallic, something that suggests rust and unseen decay. Your journey today leads you into the heart of psychological torture, not necessarily through physical torment, but through the systematic breaking of the human will in the interrogation chamber. You find yourself in a nondescript building, its exterior betraying nothing of the horrors within, yet you feel an inexplicable weight pressing down on you, a growing dread that tightens your chest. You are a silent observer in a small, windowless room. A single, harsh, bare bulb hangs from the ceiling, casting stark shadows, making every detail painfully clear. The walls are bare, stained, offering no visual distractions, no comfort. The air is cold, stale, and carries a faint, acrid scent. Sweat, fear, and something else, something metallic and sharp that makes your nose wrinkle. This is a carefully constructed psychological environment designed for maximum disorientation and isolation. Your modern comforts, the soft glow of a reading light, the privacy of your own space feel like a distant, impossible luxury. You watch as a prisoner is brought in, their face drawn, eyes hollow, body slumped. They are physically exhausted, but it is their spirit that appears most ravaged. The interrogator sits opposite, calm, collected, meticulously dressed, a stark contrast to the prisoner's disheveled state. The interrogator's voice is low, steady, reasonable, yet carries an implicit threat that vibrates in the oppressive silence. This isn't about brute force, not yet. This is about psychological warfare. The techniques are insidious. Sleep deprivation, prolonged standing, repetitive questions, isolation, sensory deprivation. These are the tools of the trade. You observe how the interrogator plays on the prisoner's fears, threats to their family, fabricated evidence of betrayal by friends, promises of release that are never fulfilled. This is a psychological experiment in vulnerability, in systematically dismantling the prisoner's sense of reality, their self-worth, and their will to resist. You feel a profound empathy for the prisoner, an aching recognition of the fragility of the human mind under such an assault. You witness the interrogator's masterful use of manipulation. They might offer a cigarette, a sip of water, a moment of false kindness, only to snatch it away. This psychological yo-yo of hope and despair is designed to keep the prisoner off balance, to break their resilience, to make them desperately crave even the smallest comfort, thus making them more pliable. You realize how easily basic human needs can be weaponized in a psychological context, turning even a glass of water into a bargaining chip for a confession. The silence of the room is almost unbearable, punctuated only by the interrogator's calm voice, the rustle of papers, and the prisoner's ragged breathing. You realize that this silence itself is a psychological weapon, amplifying every sound, every thought, every fear. It isolates the prisoner completely, denying them the comfort of external stimuli, forcing them inwards to confront their own breaking mind. Your modern world, filled with constant background noise and connectivity, feels like a noisy, comforting embrace. You observe the prisoner's slow psychological decline. Their eyes become unfocused, their answers muddled, their defiance replaced by a weary resignation. You see the point where the will to resist finally breaks, where the prisoner, desperate for an end to the psychological torment, is willing to say anything, to confess to anything, just to make it stop. This is the ultimate goal of the psychological experiment, to produce compliance, not through conviction but through utter, complete psychological exhaustion and capitulation. The interrogator might use psychological profiling, tailoring their approach to the individual prisoner's personality, their weaknesses, their fears. For some, it might be an appeal to patriotism. For others, a threat to their loved ones. For still others, the slow, methodical erosion of their intellectual certainty. You recognize the chilling expertise, the cold, calculating understanding of human psychology at play, wielded not for healing, but for destruction. You understand that the confessions obtained in these chambers are often meaningless in terms of truth. They are products of a broken mind, desperate for relief. The psychological integrity of the individual is sacrificed for the illusion of truth, for the reinforcement of the regime's narrative. This is a terrifying illustration of how easily truth can be manufactured when the psychological tools are sufficiently potent and ruthlessly applied. As the prisoner is eventually led away, a ghost of their former self, you remain in the stark, silent room, the harsh light still burning, illuminating nothing but the emptiness. You feel a profound sense of violation, a deep understanding of the vulnerability of the human mind. The interrogation chamber is more than just a place of questioning. It is a psychological laboratory where the limits of human endurance and the fragility of identity are tested to their absolute breaking point. You step back into the graying evening air, the chill feeling even more biting now. The images of that room, the calm, calculating interrogator, the broken prisoner, are seared into your mind. You realize that the weaponization of psychological pressure, of isolation, of fear, is a silent, invisible brutality that leaves deeper, more insidious scars than any physical wound. The psychological experiments conducted in these chambers were designed to obliterate the very essence of personhood, leaving behind only compliance, a hollow shell. The world outside feels vast and indifferent, yet tainted by the echoes of silent screams and broken wills. The morning sky is ablaze with an almost theatrical sunrise, painting the clouds in fiery hues of red and gold, a dramatic backdrop to the grand, orchestrated spectacle you are about to witness. Today, you are experiencing the psychological experiment of mass hysteria, the potent fusion of propaganda, spectacle, and the cult of personality, designed to sweep away individual thought and forge an unwavering collective will. You find yourself amidst a surging crowd, the air electric with anticipation, a vibrant, almost terrifying energy that pulsates through the very ground beneath your feet. You are pressed shoulder to shoulder with thousands, the collective breath of the crowd a palpable force. The scent of bodies, damp wool, and excited expectation fills your nostrils. Banners unfurl, flags wave, their symbols bold and ubiquitous. The rhythmic chanting begins, a low murmur at first, growing steadily in volume, becoming a powerful, hypnotic drone that seems to bypass your rational mind and appeal directly to a primal sense of belonging and excitement. Your modern self, accustomed to individual autonomy and critical distance, feels a profound sense of both fascination and unease at this collective surrender. The stage is set, massive and imposing, adorned with symbols of the regime. Spotlights cut through the pre-dawn gloom, creating an aura of sacred importance. You hear the swelling music, grand and Wagnerian, designed to stir deep emotions, to evoke a sense of national destiny and heroic purpose. It's a sensory overload, meticulously engineered to overwhelm individual perception and facilitate a collective emotional experience. You realize that this is not just a political rally, it is a carefully choreographed psychological ritual, a modern-day religious ceremony for the state. Then, the leader appears. Not just a man, but an icon projected onto giant screens, his image larger than life, almost mythical. A roar erupts from the crowd, a deafening wave of adoration, a primal scream of devotion that physically vibrates through your chest. You see faces contorted with emotion, tears, ecstasy, fervent belief, a terrifyingly unified expression of absolute loyalty. This is the psychological apex of the cult of personality, where a single individual becomes the embodiment of a nation's hopes, fears, and aspirations, a figure beyond critique, beyond question. His voice, when he begins to speak, is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. It starts low, almost conversational, drawing you in, making you feel as if he is speaking directly to you. Then it builds, rising in intensity, punctuated by dramatic pauses, sweeping gestures, and rhetorical flourishes. He appeals not to logic, but to emotion, to national pride, to righteous anger, to a yearning for order and glory. He articulates their unspoken fears, validates their prejudices, and offers a clear, simple path forward, a common enemy to rally against. You feel the magnetic pull, the intoxicating surge of collective emotion. It's almost impossible not to be swept up in it, to feel the shared purpose, the sense of unity. Your individual identity begins to blur, subsumed by the overwhelming power of the crowd. You realize how easily rational thought can be bypassed when emotions are running high, when the desire to belong, to be part of something grand, is so powerfully stimulated. This is the essence of mass hysteria, where individual critical faculties are suspended in favor of collective fervor. The crowd echoes his words, chants his name, performs synchronized gestures. You observe how individuals who might privately harbor doubts are now openly, enthusiastically participating. The psychological pressure to conform, to demonstrate loyalty, to avoid standing out, is immense. To remain silent, to show indifference, would be to invite suspicion, to become an other in a sea of unwavering belief. You understand that this isn't just about believing, it's about performing belief, reinforcing the illusion of universal acceptance. You witness moments of almost religious ecstasy, people fainting, weeping, reaching out as if to touch a deity. This is not political adoration. It is idol worship, a psychological transference of ultimate authority and moral rectitude onto a single figure. The leader becomes infallible, his words law, his vision absolute. Any internal dissonance, any moral conflict, is resolved by the unquestioning faith in this supreme authority. As the rally draws to a thunderous close, the leader raising his arm in a triumphant salute, the crowd responds with a final, earth-shattering roar. The energy slowly dissipates, but the psychological effects linger. You see people leaving, their faces still flushed, their eyes shining with a renewed sense of purpose, a strengthened belief. They have been psychologically recharged, their loyalty affirmed, their doubts momentarily, if not permanently, suppressed. You step away from the thinning crowd, feeling a strange mixture of exhilaration and profound dread. The psychological experiment of mass hysteria and the cult of personality is a terrifying demonstration of how easily the human mind can be manipulated, how individual agency can be willingly surrendered for the intoxicating embrace of collective fervor. You realize that such spectacles are not just for the masses. They are for the individual, designed to dismantle personal identity and rebuild it in the image of the state. As the sun sets, casting long, unsettling shadows across the now quiet square, you carry with you the echoes of that roar, the image of those ecstatic faces, and the chilling understanding of how fragile rationality can be in the face of such overwhelming emotional and psychological assault. The air still hums with residual energy, a reminder of the raw, untamed power that can be unleashed when the levers of human psychology are pulled with such ruthless precision. The morning air carries a sterile chill, a clinical precision that pervades the atmosphere, preparing you for a journey into the twisted logic of racial science and the chilling psychological experiments of eugenics. You find yourself in university halls, once bastions of enlightenment, now repurposed into centers for pseudo-scientific research, their hallowed walls echoing with the whispers of racial classifications and biological determinism. The scent of old books and dust is mingled with something sharper, something almost medicinal, hinting at the unsettling practices within. You observe academics, physicians, and anthropologists, their faces earnest, their demeanor serious, as they pore over charts, measurements, and genealogical records. They speak in measured tones about hereditary health courts, racial hygiene, and the purification of the gene pool. This is a psychological experiment in scientific justification, an attempt to cloak an ideology of hatred in the respectable garb of empirical research. You realize how profoundly dangerous it is when the tools of science are perverted to serve political ends, twisting objective inquiry into a weapon of discrimination. You witness lectures on racial typology, where Aryan traits are meticulously outlined, skull shapes, nose measurements, hair, and eye color. Slides project images of inferior races, caricatures designed to evoke disgust and fear. This is a deliberate psychological strategy of othering, creating a false biological hierarchy that justifies discrimination and violence. You see students nodding in agreement, taking diligent notes, internalizing these fabricated truths as scientific fact. Your modern understanding of genetics and anthropology recoils at the grotesque distortion of scientific principles. The psychological impact of this science is profound. For those deemed racially pure, it instills a sense of superiority, of innate worthiness, boosting their confidence and their allegiance to the regime that validates their existence. For those categorized as inferior, it is a devastating psychological blow, stripping them of their dignity, their identity, reducing them to genetic defects. You imagine the weight of such a designation, the crushing feeling of being told by experts that your very being is a flaw. You hear discussions about the T4 program, the euthanasia of the unfit, the mentally ill, the physically disabled, the chronically ill. The language is clinical, euphemistic, mercy killing, life unworthy of life, alleviating suffering. This is a psychological experiment in moral inversion, where compassion is reinterpreted as cruelty and murder is presented as a humane act. You understand how vital this linguistic manipulation is to allow individuals, doctors, nurses, administrators, to participate in atrocities without confronting the full moral horror of their actions. You observe the process of racial vetting for marriage, where couples must prove their Aryan purity before they are permitted to wed. This is a psychological intrusion into the most intimate aspects of personal life, transforming love and companionship into a state-regulated transaction based on genetics. It breeds suspicion, fear, and a constant self-surveillance, where individuals are forced to scrutinize their own ancestry for any date. Your modern belief in personal autonomy and the freedom to choose your partner is utterly violated by this chilling control. The eugenics program isn't just about eliminating undesirables, it's also about promoting the birth of desirables. You hear doctors encouraging racially pure women to have more children, offering incentives, linking their fertility to national duty. This is a psychological pressure to conform to a state-defined biological role, to view one's body as a resource for the regime, rather than as a vessel for personal choice and family building. You reflect on the psychological burden this places on those forced to administer these policies. The doctors, nurses, and scientists who participate are not necessarily monsters. Many are driven by a warped sense of duty, a misguided belief in scientific progress, or simply the overwhelming pressure to conform. The psychological experiment here is to show how professional ethics can be systematically dismantled, how individuals can rationalize their participation in profound evil when it is sanctioned by the state and cloaked in scientific authority. As evening descends, casting long, unsettling shadows through the lecture halls, you feel a deep sense of despair. The psychological experiment of racial purity and eugenics is a chilling testament to the power of ideology to corrupt science, to twist morality, and to inflict irreparable damage on the human psyche, both on those targeted and on those who become instruments of its implementation. It is a profound assault on the very notion of shared humanity. You leave the now silent university, the scent of dust and something vaguely antiseptic lingering in your nostrils. You carry with you the weight of distorted knowledge, the images of racial charts and unfit labels. You realize that the systematic dehumanization inherent in eugenics is a psychological wound that runs far deeper than physical scars, poisoning the well of human empathy and fostering a cold, calculating cruelty that can justify any atrocity in the name of a manufactured biological ideal. The night air feels thin and cold, and you pull your coat tighter, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that has settled deep within your soul. a chill born of humanity's darkest scientific perversions. The morning dawns with a muted, metallic light, the sky overcast, reflecting the grim reality that has now fully enveloped the nation: war. Your journey today immerses you in the psychological battlefield, where the mind becomes the ultimate weapon and propaganda transforms into an instrument of war. You find yourself in bustling propaganda offices where the frantic energy is palpable yet controlled, a terrifyingly efficient machine dedicated to shaping perception and manipulating emotions. The air hums with the static electricity of printing presses and the clatter of typewriters, overlaid with the faint scent of ink and ambition. You observe designers, writers and artists, their faces strained but focused, churning out an incessant stream of posters, pamphlets, radio scripts, and film reels. Their work is meticulous, every image, every word, every sound bite carefully crafted for maximum psychological impact. This is a sophisticated, large-scale psychological experiment in mass persuasion, designed not just to inform but to incite, to inspire, to demonize, and to crush dissent. Your modern understanding of media manipulation pales in comparison to the scale and ruthlessness of this wartime propaganda machine. You witness the creation of narratives, heroic tales of German soldiers, triumphant advances, valiant sacrifices. These stories are designed to boost morale, to foster national pride, and to create an unwavering belief in ultimate victory. You see how doubt is systematically suppressed, how setbacks are spun as strategic retreats or temporary challenges, bolstering the psychological resilience of the populace. The goal is to maintain an unbreakable collective will, to prevent psychological collapse in the face of hardship. Conversely, you see the demonization of the enemy, grotesque caricatures of Allied leaders, portrayals of opposing forces as barbaric and subhuman. This is a critical psychological strategy designed to dehumanize the enemy, to justify the violence against them, and to make the act of killing easier for soldiers. You understand that this psychological preparation is crucial for sustained warfare, transforming the enemy from fellow human beings into abstract targets, thereby lowering the moral threshold for violence. You hear radio broadcasts, their voices imbued with unwavering conviction, relaying official news, patriotic songs, and stirring speeches. These broadcasts are a constant psychological presence, reaching into every home, reinforcing the official narrative and creating a shared reality. You realize how isolating it would be to try and resist this constant barrage, how easily your own perceptions could be warped when every source of information sings the same tune. You observe the psychological impact of terror propaganda, posters depicting the horrors of enemy aggression, the threat of invasion, the need for vigilance. This fear-mongering is designed to galvanize the population, to justify extreme measures, and to ensure unwavering support for the war effort, no matter the cost. You feel a prickle of anxiety yourself, realizing the insidious effectiveness of fear as a motivator. The psychological warfare extends beyond national borders. Leaflets are dropped behind enemy lines, sowing seeds of doubt, spreading disinformation, undermining morale. Radio broadcasts are beamed to enemy territories, tailored to exploit social divisions, economic hardships, and war weariness. This is a sophisticated psychological assault on the enemy's will to fight, an attempt to break their spirit from within. You see film crews creating newsreels, carefully edited to show only victories, only strength, only unity. The psychological message is clear. Germany is invincible, its cause righteous, its people unbreakable. These visual narratives are powerful, bypassing rational thought and appealing directly to emotion, creating an immersive, albeit false, reality for the viewing public. You realize that this massive psychological experiment is also being conducted on the soldiers themselves. They are fed a constant diet of propaganda, instilled with a sense of racial superiority and an unshakable belief in their mission. They are trained to depersonalize the enemy, to suppress empathy, and to follow orders without question. This psychological conditioning is crucial for their ability to perform horrific acts of violence on the battlefield and in occupied territories. As the day fades into a dim, war-torn twilight and the propaganda offices finally quieten, you retreat to your small, cold room, the scent of ink and desperate ambition clinging to your clothes. The psychological battlefield, you realize, is just as brutal, if not more so, than the physical one. It is a relentless assault on truth, on empathy, on the very capacity for independent thought. You reflect on the sheer scale of the psychological manipulation, the cunning and ruthlessness with which it is deployed. The war, you understand, is being fought not just for territory, but for the minds of men and women, for their beliefs, for their very souls. The air outside your window feels heavy with the weight of fabricated narratives and manipulated emotions, and you pull your coat tighter, a futile attempt to ward off the cold dread that stems from understanding the true cost of psychological warfare. The morning air today is thick with a sickening stench, a cloying, pervasive odor of ash, fear, and human waste that claws at your throat and makes your stomach churn. You find yourself at the gates of a place beyond human comprehension, a realm designed as the ultimate psychological experiment, a concentration camp. The imposing barbed wire fences, the guard towers, the grim, unyielding architecture all scream of despair and total control. Every fiber of your being recoils, yet you are compelled to observe, to understand the psychological hell created here. You step inside, the crunch of gravel underfoot, strangely loud in the oppressive silence. The first thing you notice is the pervasive, bone-deep cold, a physical discomfort that mirrors the psychological desolation. You see the prisoners, hollow-eyed, emaciated figures in striped uniforms, their movements slow, despairing. Their faces are devoid of emotion, stripped bare by relentless suffering, a chilling testament to the psychological stripping away of identity and hope. Your modern comforts, your hot showers, your nourishing food, your soft bed, feel like a cruel joke in this landscape of ultimate deprivation. The psychological experiment here is one of total deprivation, sensory, emotional, physical, and intellectual. Prisoners are systematically robbed of everything that defines them as individuals, their names replaced by numbers, their clothes by dehumanizing uniforms, their possessions confiscated, their dignity systematically assaulted. This process is designed to break the human spirit, to reduce individuals to mere biological functions, to make them utterly dependent on their tormentors. You feel a profound sense of helplessness, a chilling recognition of how easily human beings can be reduced to this state. You observe the psychological impact of constant hunger, cold, and exhaustion. These physical deprivations are not just about pain. They are powerful psychological tools, eroding cognitive function, dulling emotions, and making resistance almost impossible. The mind, constantly focused on basic survival, has little capacity left for defiance or hope. You realize the profound connection between physical suffering and psychological subjugation. The guards, often young and seemingly ordinary, move with a chilling indifference, their faces impassive, their commands sharp and brutal. You witness random acts of violence, arbitrary punishments, the constant threat of brutality hanging heavy in the air. This unpredictability is a potent psychological weapon, fostering a state of constant fear and anxiety, making it impossible for prisoners to find any semblance of safety or routine. The human mind, desperate for predictability, is kept in a perpetual state of terror. You see the psychological phenomenon of camp madness, a dissociation from reality, a retreat into oneself as a coping mechanism against unbearable suffering. Some prisoners stare blankly, others murmur to themselves, still others exhibit bursts of irrational behavior. This is the human mind's desperate attempt to survive in an environment designed to destroy it, a profound psychological breaking point. The psychological experiment also extends to the kapos, prisoners appointed by the SS to supervise other prisoners. You observe the psychological transformation of these individuals, how the small measure of power granted to them can corrupt, how they often become more brutal than the guards themselves, desperate to prove their loyalty and ensure their own survival. This is a chilling illustration of how power, even in its most limited forms, can be used to turn victim against victim, further eroding trust and collective resistance. You witness the psychological effects of forced labor, meaningless backbreaking work designed not for productivity, but for punishment, for exhaustion, for further dehumanization. The absence of purpose, the futility of the effort, grinds down the human spirit, leaving only a hollow emptiness. Your modern sense of purpose and achievement is a distant memory in this realm of systematic desolation. The psychological environment is one of total isolation. Families are separated, communication is forbidden, and any attempt at forming bonds of friendship is brutally suppressed. This deliberate severing of human connection is a powerful psychological tool, denying prisoners the comfort of shared suffering, the solace of empathy, and the strength of collective resistance. You realize how vital human connection is for psychological well-being, and how its systematic denial can lead to utter despair. As the sun sets, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of barracks, you remain amidst the chilling silence broken only by the distant cries of guards and the faint moans of the dying. The concentration camp is the ultimate psychological laboratory, a place where the human spirit is subjected to the most extreme forms of deprivation and terror, designed to break the will, to extinguish hope, and to annihilate the very essence of personhood. You finally step back outside the gates, the putrid smell clinging to your clothes, the pervasive cold seeping into your bones. The images of those hollow eyes, the emaciated bodies, the chilling indifference of the guards are seared into your mind. You realize that the psychological experiments conducted here were not just about extracting information or punishing dissent. They were about exploring the absolute limits of human endurance, about proving that even the strongest spirit could be utterly broken through systematic deprivation and terror. The night air feels heavy, saturated with the silent screams of shattered souls, and you know that the scars left by these psychological atrocities will forever haunt the collective consciousness of humanity. The morning sky is a vast, indifferent canvas, a stark contrast to the intense and often disturbing focus of your current observation. Today, you are diving deeper into the chilling psychological experiment of race science, not in its academic theorizing, but in its brutal, everyday application. You find yourself in a medical facility, yet its atmosphere is not one of healing, but of cold, calculating assessment. A place where human beings are reduced to mere biological specimens to be measured, categorized, and ultimately judged. The antiseptic scent of disinfectant is unsettlingly mixed with something else, something clinical and invasive, hinting at the profound dehumanization within. You observe doctors and researchers, their faces serious, their movements precise, meticulously examining individuals brought before them. They wield calipers, measuring tapes and charts, recording skull dimensions, nose lengths, eye colors, hair textures. These are not medical examinations aimed at restoring health. They are psychological assessments designed to establish racial purity or racial inferiority. You realize the immense psychological weight of being subjected to such an examination, of having your very identity reduced to a collection of physical traits to be dissected and judged against an arbitrary, ideologically driven standard. Your modern sense of individual dignity and worth is utterly trampled by this cold, analytical scrutiny. You witness the psychological impact on those being measured. Some stand impassively, their eyes vacant, having clearly undergone this process countless times, their spirit broken by the constant objectification. Others show fleeting glimpses of fear, shame, or defiance, quickly suppressed under the stern gazes of their assessors. This is a psychological experiment in self-objectification, forcing individuals to view themselves through the lens of their oppressors, to internalize the regime's definition of their worth. You hear the casual, detached language used by the assessors, referring to individuals as specimens, cases, subjects. This linguistic dehumanization is a powerful psychological tool, allowing the assessors to perform their tasks without empathy, to distance themselves from the human beings they are evaluating. It reinforces the idea that these are not people, but biological entities to be catalogued and processed according to scientific or pseudo-scientific criteria. The psychological ramifications extend beyond the individual. Entire communities are subjected to these racial hygiene assessments, creating divisions, fostering suspicion, and sowing seeds of fear. Families are torn apart based on these arbitrary classifications, children removed from their parents, futures shattered. This systematic disruption of social bonds is a profound psychological assault on community cohesion, designed to isolate and weaken collective resistance. You observe the decisions being made based on these measurements. Some individuals are deemed racially valuable and given preferential treatment, perhaps even encouraged to participate in programs like Lebensborn. Others are categorized as undesirable, condemned to forced sterilization, incarceration, or worse. This is a psychological experiment in arbitrary power where life and death, freedom and bondage are determined by the cold, unfeeling application of pseudo-scientific criteria. You realize the terrifying power invested in these experts and the profound psychological burden of living in a world where your fate hinges on such an assessment. You reflect on the psychological profiles of the race scientists themselves. Many are highly educated, intelligent individuals. How do they rationalize their participation in such morally repugnant work? You understand that they often operate within a closed ideological system, where their research is seen as serving a higher national purpose, where dissent is suppressed, and where peer pressure reinforces conformity. This is a chilling illustration of how intelligent minds can be led astray, how professional ethics can be subverted, and how the desire for scientific validation can be twisted into an instrument of profound evil. You recognize the insidious nature of this race science as a psychological tool. It provides a seemingly rational, objective justification for persecution, making it easier for the general public to accept and for the perpetrators to commit atrocities. It appeals to a desire for order, for control, for a scientific explanation for societal problems, however false and destructive that explanation may be. Your modern world, with its awareness of historical abuses, struggles constantly against the echoes of such justifications. As dusk settles over the medical facility, and the last of the specimens are led away, you remain in the cold, sterile air, the scent of antiseptic and something vaguely human clinging to your senses. The psychological experiment of race science in action is a terrifying demonstration of how scientific authority, when corrupted by ideology, can be used to dehumanize, to justify mass murder, and to inflict irreparable damage on the human psyche. It is a profound assault on the very notion of human equality and dignity. You leave the now silent facility, the images of calipers and measuring tapes seared into your mind, the faces of the assessed individuals haunting your thoughts. You realize that the systematic application of race science was not just a biological folly, it was a deeply psychological project, designed to reshape identity, to destroy empathy, and to create a moral vacuum in which unspeakable acts could be committed under the guise of scientific progress. The night air feels heavy, saturated with the silent cries of those reduced to measurements, and you know that the chilling legacy of this psychological perversion will forever serve as a stark warning to humanity. The morning dawns with a quiet, almost unsettling normalcy, a stark contrast to the extraordinary evil you've been observing. Today, your focus shifts to a particularly disturbing psychological experiment, the impact on the perpetrators themselves. You are in an administrative office, seemingly mundane, filled with desks, typewriters, and filing cabinets. The air smells of stale coffee, paper, and the faint, metallic scent of bureaucratic efficiency. You feel a strange chill, recognizing that true horror can often wear the mask of routine. You observe men and women, clerks, mid-level functionaries, officers, going about their daily tasks. They fill out forms, process requisitions, attend meetings, argue over minor procedural details. They might complain about their wives, discuss the local football team, or fret over their children's schooling. They are, for the most part, outwardly unremarkable, seemingly ordinary people. This is the chilling psychological phenomenon of the banality of evil, where monstrous acts are carried out by individuals who do not fit the stereotype of the raving psychopath. Your modern understanding of evil, often personified by dramatic villains, is challenged by this quiet, efficient malevolence. You listen to their conversations, devoid of any emotional reflection on the consequences of their work. They discuss transport schedules, quota fulfillment, special actions, all euphemisms for mass murder and brutal persecution. The language is clinical, bureaucratic, and intellectualized distancing mechanism designed to obscure the horrific reality of their actions. This linguistic manipulation is a powerful psychological tool, allowing perpetrators to maintain a veneer of normalcy and avoid confronting the moral implications of their involvement. You witness moments of mild frustration, boredom, or even petty office politics. These ordinary human reactions are jarringly out of place given the context of their work, highlighting the profound psychological compartmentalization at play. Individuals are able to separate their work selves, which facilitate atrocity, from their private selves, which engage in ordinary human concerns. This psychological splitting is crucial for their ability to function, to avoid mental breakdown, and to continue their complicity. You observe the psychological pressure to conform, to question orders, to express dissent, would not only jeopardize their careers but their very lives. The reward for compliance, however, is security, promotion, social acceptance within the regime. This creates a powerful psychological incentive to participate, to become a willing cog in the machine, allowing individuals to rationalize their actions as merely doing their duty. You understand that this isn't just about ideological conviction. It's about survival, ambition, and the powerful human desire to fit in. The lack of direct personal contact with the victims for many of these perpetrators is a key psychological factor. They are often far removed from the actual violence, dealing with paperwork, logistics, or administrative oversight. This distance allows for a greater degree of psychological detachment, making it easier to dehumanize the target groups and to avoid personal responsibility. You realize how easily abstract bureaucracy can become an instrument of mass murder when the human element is systematically removed. You see individuals who exhibit genuine enthusiasm for the ideology, whose belief in the regime's mission is sincere. For these perpetrators, their actions are morally justified within their own warped framework, and they experience no apparent psychological conflict. This is a terrifying illustration of how a deeply ingrained, unquestioning ideology can completely warp an individual's moral compass, leading them to commit unspeakable acts with a clear conscience. You reflect on the psychological toll, even for those who seem outwardly unaffected. The constant exposure to propaganda, the suppression of empathy, the internalization of hatred, these processes undoubtedly leave deep psychological scars, even if they are not immediately visible. The human spirit, you realize, cannot endlessly commit evil without some internal cost, however delayed or sublimated that cost may be. As the day ends and the administrative offices empty out, the silence feels heavy with the echoes of unseen tragedies and unacknowledged guilt. The psychological experiment of the perpetrators is a chilling testament to the human capacity for self-deception, compartmentalization, and rationalization in the face of profound evil. It demonstrates how ordinary people, under the right conditions, can become instruments of atrocity, not out of inherent malice, but out of a terrifying combination of obedience, ambition, and a cultivated indifference. You step out into the cooling evening air, the scent of coal smoke now mingled with the invisible residue of bureaucratic evil. You carry with you the unsettling image of those ordinary faces, those mundane tasks, and the profound psychological understanding that evil is not always loud and dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, methodical, and chillingly ordinary. The night feels vast and indifferent, and you know that the legacy of these psychological accommodations to atrocity will forever serve as a stark warning about the fragility of the human moral compass. The morning sky is bruised with heavy clouds, a reflection of the deep, pervasive sorrow that hangs in the air. Today, your journey takes you into the psychological aftermath, into the shattered minds and enduring suffering of those who survived the unimaginable. You find yourself in the years immediately following the war, in a landscape of rubble and despair, where the physical destruction is matched only by the psychological wreckage. The scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and a pervasive sense of loss fills your nostrils, a constant reminder of the profound trauma that permeates everything. You observe the survivors, their bodies often emaciated, scarred, but it is their eyes that tell the true story of their psychological torment. They are hollow, distant, haunted, reflecting a world of terror and loss that no words can fully convey. They move with a slowness, a weariness that goes beyond physical exhaustion, a profound psychological fatigue that has settled deep within their souls. Your modern world, with its focus on rapid recovery and therapeutic interventions, feels utterly inadequate in the face of such profound, systemic trauma. You witness the psychological manifestations of their experiences, sudden, startled responses to loud noises, an inability to trust, pervasive nightmares that steal their sleep, a profound sense of guilt for having survived when so many did not. This is a living psychological experiment in extreme trauma, demonstrating the devastating, long-lasting impact of systematic dehumanization, violence, and loss on the human psyche. You feel a deep empathy and aching recognition of the irreparable damage inflicted upon these souls. You see the difficulty they face in reconnecting with a normal world. Many struggle to speak of their experiences, the words often failing to capture the horror, the memories too painful to articulate. They carry an immense psychological burden, a private hell that sets them apart from those who cannot comprehend. The psychological isolation is profound, even when surrounded by others. The psychological impact of starvation and deprivation has left not only physical scars, but also deep-seated psychological patterns. A fear of hunger, an inability to waste food, a constant anxiety about basic necessities. These are not just physical reactions, but deeply ingrained psychological responses to extreme hardship. You realize how profoundly the body and mind are interconnected, how physical deprivation warps psychological well-being. You observe the struggle with identity. Stripped of their names, their families, their former lives, many survivors grapple with a shattered sense of self. Who are they now after all they have endured? The psychological work of rebuilding an identity, of finding meaning in a world that has been utterly brutalized, is an almost insurmountable task. Your own secure sense of self, shaped by personal history and relationships, feels like a precious and fragile gift. You hear stories, whispered fragments of memory, tales of unimaginable cruelty and profound loss. The psychological burden of these memories is immense, a constant replay of trauma that refuses to fade. Some survivors attempt to suppress them, to forget, but the memories lurk beneath the surface, manifesting in anxiety, depression, and a pervasive sense of dread. The psychological effects are intergenerational. Children born to survivors often carry the unspoken weight of their parents' trauma, manifesting in their own anxieties, their own struggles with trust and identity. This is a chilling psychological experiment in the transmission of trauma, demonstrating how the wounds of one generation can echo through the next, leaving a lasting legacy of pain and unresolved psychological conflict. As evening descends and the air grows cold and still, you remain amongst the shadows of shattered lives, listening to the unspoken stories, feeling the weight of the collective grief. The psychological trauma of the survivors is a stark, enduring testament to the catastrophic human cost of the Nazi regime's experiments in dehumanization and terror. It reveals the profound fragility of the human mind and its remarkable, yet often burdened, capacity for endurance in the face of unspeakable evil. You step away from the desolate landscape, the scent of decay and loss clinging to your clothes. The images of those haunted eyes, those broken spirits, are seared into your consciousness. You realize that the most profound psychological experiments were not those conducted in laboratories, but those inflicted upon an entire populace, leaving behind a legacy of trauma that continues to reverberate through history, a chilling reminder of the long-term, devastating psychological consequences of hatred and inhumanity. The night air feels heavy, saturated with silent screams and the echoes of shattered dreams, a constant lament for what was lost and what can never truly be healed. The morning light is cold and unforgiving, cutting through the remnants of fog to reveal a landscape still grappling with the ghosts of the past. Today, your journey is into the unseen psychological scars left on German society as a whole, a sprawling, complex, and often painful psychological experiment in collective guilt, memory, and denial. You find yourself amidst a nation rebuilding physically but struggling profoundly with the psychological burden of its recent history. The air, though cleaner now, carries a subtle, lingering scent of buried secrets and unspoken truths. You observe the pervasive silence. In public spaces, in homes, there is an unspoken agreement to avoid certain topics, to skirt around the recent past. People busy themselves with reconstruction, with the mundane tasks of daily life, their faces often tight, their eyes avoiding direct gaze when sensitive subjects are broached. This collective psychological coping mechanism of silence and denial is a profound attempt to distance themselves from the horrific acts committed in their name, to compartmentalize the past and move forward without fully processing the trauma of their complicity. Your modern culture, with its emphasis on open discourse and historical reckoning, finds this silence deeply unsettling. You witness the psychological phenomenon of victimhood. Many Germans, having endured bombing raids, displacement, and economic ruin, focus on their own suffering, subtly shifting the narrative to portray themselves primarily as victims of the war, rather than as perpetrators or complicit bystanders of the regime's atrocities. This psychological reframing is a complex coping mechanism, a way to alleviate the immense burden of collective guilt, allowing individuals to avoid confronting their own roles, however passive. In the horrors that unfolded, you see the profound psychological impact of external judgment. As the world condemns Nazi Germany, German society grapples with a shattered national identity, a profound shame. This external pressure, while necessary for accountability, also contributes to the defensive psychological posture, making open self-reflection even more difficult for some, fostering resentment rather than genuine introspection. The psychological struggle with truth is palpable. For years, there is a deliberate downplaying of the regime's atrocities, a refusal to fully acknowledge the scale and nature of the crimes. This collective psychological blindness, born of shame and self-preservation, obstructs true healing and prevents a genuine reckoning with history. You realize how deeply psychological defense mechanisms can shape a nation's ability to confront its own past. You observe the subtle ways in which the ideology, even after its military defeat, continues to exert a psychological influence. While overt symbols are banned, the underlying prejudices, the ingrained habits of obedience, the deep-seated fears of others linger in some corners of society, manifesting in whispers, in subtle discriminations, in a resistance to fully embrace democratic values. This is a chilling illustration of how deeply a pervasive psychological conditioning can penetrate the collective unconscious, leaving residual effects long after the official end of the regime. The psychological experiment here is ongoing, a continuous struggle within the collective German psyche to confront, to mourn, to atone, and to ultimately integrate its horrific past into a new national identity. It's a battle against denial, against forgetting, against the seductive comfort of silence. You see later generations grappling with the psychological legacy, wrestling with the sins of their fathers and grandfathers, a burden of inherited memory that forces them to confront questions of complicity and responsibility that their elders avoided. You reflect on the immense psychological burden of collective guilt, an invisible weight carried by an entire nation. How does a society heal from such a profound moral injury? How does it rebuild trust, both internally and with the outside world? The psychological work is immense, painstaking, and generational. It requires a relentless commitment to truth, a profound capacity for empathy, and an unwavering determination to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. As evening descends, casting long, somber shadows over the rebuilt cities, you feel the profound silence of unspoken history, the lingering presence of unseen wounds. The psychological scars on society are not always visible, not always dramatic, but they are deep, pervasive, and profoundly influential. They shape political discourse, cultural identity, and individual psyches for generations. You step back from this landscape of uneasy peace, the scent of hidden truths clinging to the air. You carry with you the profound understanding that the psychological experiments of Nazi Germany left not only individual victims shattered, but an entire society grappling with a collective trauma that continues to reverberate through time. The night air feels heavy, saturated with the echoes of untold stories and the profound, enduring psychological weight of a nation's reckoning. The morning dawns with a muted, hesitant light, as if the sun itself is wary of illuminating the world too brightly. Today, your focus is on a profound and pervasive psychological legacy, the erosion of trust, a silent but devastating consequence of the Nazi regime's systematic use of fear and betrayal. You find yourself in the post-war landscape, not just observing physical reconstruction, but sensing the invisible barriers between people, the subtle psychological hesitations that hint at a deep-seated suspicion. The air carries the lingering scent of damp earth and rebuilding, but also an indefinable aroma of caution and guardedness. You observe the subtle shifts in human interaction. Conversations are often guarded, cautious. People are hesitant to share personal opinions, to fully trust outsiders, or even at times each other. This is a direct psychological consequence of years spent under a regime where neighbors reported on neighbors, children were encouraged to inform on parents, and the state was an omnipresent, malevolent eavesdropper. The constant threat of betrayal, of arbitrary punishment for a wrong word, has left an indelible psychological imprint, a deep-seated distrust of authority and of fellow human beings. Your modern world, with its expectation of open communication and relative social safety, feels remarkably fragile in comparison. You witness the psychological difficulty in rebuilding institutions. How do you trust the police, the courts, the government, when these very institutions were once instruments of oppression and terror? The pervasive psychological conditioning to fear authority, to view the state as an enemy rather than a protector, is a formidable barrier to the establishment of a functional democratic society. This is an ongoing psychological experiment in rehabilitation, a struggle to re-establish the fundamental bonds of civic trust after they have been utterly shattered. The psychological impact on personal relationships is profound. The fear of intimacy, the reluctance to truly open up to another person, the lingering suspicion that even loved ones could be informants. These are the silent scars of a society that weaponized trust. You see, older generations struggle with this. Their interactions marked by a guardedness that is difficult to shake, a constant psychological self-censorship that has become second nature. You observe the profound psychological difficulty of those who were victims. How do you trust anyone after being betrayed, tortured, and dehumanized by those who represented authority, and even by those who were supposed to be your peers? The deep psychological wounds of betrayal leave survivors in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats, unable to relax into the comfort of trust. This profound erosion of trust is one of the most devastating psychological legacies of the regime. You reflect on the psychological burden on those who were complicit or even active participants in the regime. How do they ever truly trust themselves or others after having committed or condoned such atrocities? The guilt, whether acknowledged or suppressed, creates an internal psychological landscape of distrust, suspicion, and self-recrimination. The very act of betrayal, you realize, poisons the well of trust for both the betrayed and the betrayer. The psychological experiment here is to show how deeply fear, when systematically applied, can dismantle the very fabric of human connection. Trust is the foundation of society, of community, of intimacy. When trust is deliberately, relentlessly eroded, society fragments. Individuals become isolated, and the capacity for collective action, for empathy, for genuine human connection is severely hampered. You feel the pervasive sense of unease, the unspoken fear, the lingering distrust that hangs in the air like a persistent mist. It is not always overt.
Often, it is subtle, manifesting in a glance, a hesitation, a carefully chosen word.
But its psychological presence is undeniable, a constant reminder of the profound damage inflicted upon the human spirit when fear becomes the dominant force in society. As evening descends, casting long, unsettling shadows across the landscape, you sense the heavy psychological burden of a world that learned to distrust. The legacy of fear and trust erosion, you realize, is not just a historical footnote. It is a profound psychological wound that continues to reverberate through generations, shaping social interactions, political development, and individual psyches. You step back from this landscape of guarded interactions and unspoken fears, the sense of caution clinging to your own being. You carry with you the profound understanding that the psychological experiments of Nazi Germany didn't just end with the war. They left an enduring legacy of fear that made people strangers to one another and made the world a far more dangerous and suspicious place. The night air feels heavy, saturated with the echoes of betrayals and the silent longing for a trust that was systematically destroyed. The morning is crisp and clear, a stark, almost blinding contrast to the dark psychological landscapes you've traversed. You find yourself now not in the past, but in the present, your modern world, yet you perceive the subtle, unsettling echoes of those strange psychological experiments, the lingering residue of that darkness. The air smells clean of fresh modernity, yet you carry with you the ghostly sense of cold, fear, and human despair. This final observation is a profound psychological reflection on the enduring warning that history whispers to us. You look around you at your society, your digital interconnectedness, your freedoms, and you realize how precious and how fragile they are. The psychological experiments of Nazi Germany, you now understand, were not just isolated historical events. They were a chilling demonstration of universal human vulnerabilities. The susceptibility to propaganda, the allure of charismatic leadership, the power of groupthink, the tendency towards obedience to authority, the ease with which others can be dehumanized. These are not unique to one historical moment, but are inherent dangers within the human psyche itself. Your modern comforts, your sense of security, feel less absolute, more earned, and profoundly dependent on constant vigilance. You see the echoes in the language of contemporary politics, the subtle demonization of minority groups, the appeals to nationalism, the simplistic solutions offered by authoritarian figures. You recognize the same psychological tactics, albeit in more refined forms, at play in various corners of your world. The constant repetition of a narrative, the creation of an us versus them, the fostering of fear and suspicion. These are not new inventions, but the recycled tools of psychological manipulation honed in the fires of the past. You understand the psychological imperative of critical thinking, the ability to question, to challenge authority, to seek diverse perspectives, to resist simplistic narratives. These are the essential psychological defenses against the kind of manipulation you witnessed. You realize how easily your own mind, even today, can be swayed by strong emotions, by compelling rhetoric if you allow your critical faculties to be lulled into complacency. You reflect on the importance of empathy, the systematic dehumanization, the stripping away of human dignity was the psychological precursor to unspeakable atrocities. To resist such a descent, you recognize the vital need to cultivate empathy, to constantly remind yourself and others of the shared humanity that binds us all, regardless of differences. It is a psychological shield against the insidious power of hatred. The legacy of fear and distrust, you recognize, still permeates certain aspects of global relations and individual interactions. A silent psychological reverberation from a time when trust was systematically destroyed. You understand that rebuilding trust, both interpersonally and internationally, is a continuous, painstaking psychological effort, constantly fighting against the shadows of past betrayals. You grasp the psychological fragility of institutions, your democratic systems, your legal frameworks, your ethical guidelines. These are not immutable. They are products of human effort, and they require constant psychological maintenance, constant vigilance against those who would seek to exploit human vulnerabilities for their own nefarious ends. The psychological experiments of the past serve as a chilling blueprint for how easily seemingly stable societies can unravel. As you consider the vastness of the psychological experiments you've witnessed, from mass conditioning to individual torment, from ideological infusion to the destruction of trust, you realize that the most profound lesson is not just about a specific regime, but about the darker capabilities of the human mind itself. It is a sober reminder that the line between order and chaos, between humanity and barbarism, is far thinner than you might wish to believe, and that it is maintained through constant, conscious psychological effort. As the day transitions to evening and the familiar comforts of your modern life surround you, you carry with you a profound understanding, a deep, unsettling wisdom. The strange psychological experiments of Nazi Germany are not just stories from a distant past. They are enduring warnings, whispered echoes in the collective human consciousness. They remind you of the constant need for vigilance, for empathy, for critical thought,
and for the unwavering defense of human dignity. You pull your blankets up tight.
the warmth, a comforting contrast to the cold psychological truths you've confronted. The silence of your room is now imbued with a different kind of weight, a new understanding of the human condition. The echoes of those experiments, you realize, will always be there, a constant reminder that the battle for the human mind, for its capacity for good, for its resistance to evil, is an eternal one. Sleep well, but never forget the lessons learned from those dark, chilling psychological experiments of the past.